So let's carry on with our discussion of security and talk about protecting the network, or as I put it in the title, protecting the users from the scum of the network. So over the past few videos, we've talked about who wants to attack us and why they might want to attack us and how they might carry out those attacks. So how do we protect the users and our network infrastructure from these attacks? Now we'll talk about some specific methods you can use for securing various parts of the infrastructure, but it basically boils down to defense in depth. Basically, don't depend on just one layer of defense to protect the network. A lot of people will say, oh, well, I've got a firewall out in front of my network. That's going to be good enough. Well, what happens if someone happens to get past that firewall? Let's say they compromise a web server that sits behind that firewall. Now they have control over a web server that might be sitting right on the inside of your network, and they can use that as a platform to attack further inside your network, attack other machines, attack your network infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So you want to practice defense in depth. Basically, you protect the perimeter. You set up a firewall, you set up proxy servers and NAT and reverse proxy. And again, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on exactly how to set all of that up, but just know that you have to protect the perimeter. You have to protect your off-site connections, protect your internet connection. Make sure that you have a good, strong router out in front of your internet connection that could handle a potential DDoS. And maybe even use an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system to automatically blacklist certain IP addresses when they start behaving badly. You protect your workstations. You make sure that all of the software is up to date on your workstation, so that way if someone does happen to make it past the perimeter and make it past your internet connection, then it's going to be more difficult for them to find a foothold on your workstations because they're all patched and they're all running the latest version of the operating system patches and the application patches. And obviously you have to protect your servers. Make sure that they have all of the necessary patches. Make sure that they're configured to only allow connections to the other machines that they need to connect to. If you have a web server that has to talk to a database server, make sure that that database server only accepts connections from the web server and from whatever other administrative workstations you might need to manage that database server. So now let's talk about a few specifics. Step one will be firewalls. And a firewall in a computer networking context is much like the firewall in a car. It protects you from the engine, somewhere you don't really want to be, and it allows certain connections between the inside of the car, the steering wheel, the turn signal, the radio, and the engine compartment to control the way the car moves, to control the throttle in the engine, to control the electrical system. In a computer context, firewalls sit at the perimeter of the network, and they only allow specific connections to specific machines. We'll discuss exactly how that works, and I've got one of my patented diagrams here at the bottom of this slide. You'll see that in a few seconds, and it'll make a little more sense then. Firewalls can reduce the likelihood of access attack, because honestly, if they can't get into the network, then they can't try usernames and passwords. They can't run one of those network vulnerability scanning tools that we mentioned in the previous video. The next step is to set up what's called a DMZ, or a demilitarized zone. And once again, the computer world takes terms from the real world, if you will, and uses them in a networking context. A DMZ is just like it is between North and South Korea, at least as it is between North and South Korea as of late 2012. It's an area where no one really wants to go. It's an area that's not quite in the enemy territory, and it's not quite in our territory. It's kind of a middle ground where we can meet if we have to. Here's one of my patented diagrams that I just mentioned. So you have a machine out here on the internet, and it needs to access a server that's inside your network. Well, you could just allow a direct connection from this workstation on the internet to your server. And if this is a web server, they will attach to port 80. However, if this is a Windows web server, you probably are running lots of other protocols on this guy as well that would be exposed out to the internet if you just left it out there for all the world to connect to. A DMZ involves putting a firewall between this web server and any other machines that are inside this DMZ. Let's say that this web server has to talk to a database server. And so this database server can sit out in the DMZ. However, the firewall does not allow access to the database server. But let's say you have to have access to resources inside the network, and that's where the second half of the DMZ comes into play. You have another firewall that protects your internal network, and then these servers in the DMZ can talk to mainframes or other servers inside the network or to video conference systems. At least those are the examples that I have here. And obviously any traffic coming from inside your network, since it's coming from a more secure zone, can pass out right through both of these firewalls out to whatever hosts on the internet they need to access. We will pick up with our discussion of protecting the network in the next video.